putting these earbuds in my ear because part of what I want to do is make sure that every talk is accessible. It's been a priority for me, especially over the last year when I learned a lot around accessibility around the deaf and hard of hearing community. And so what I'm using, just so you guys know the technology, Microsoft PowerPoint actually has live voice to text. It's not 100%. You'll see some errors in here. But if you subscribe for an Office 365 account, and as long as you're connected to an internet connection that's really solid, it's actually pretty good, and it's better than nothing. So I encourage you, if you ever go to talks or if you're giving a talk or you're going to talks and you know the conference organizers, encourage them to either hire an ASL interpreter or make sure that there's technology like this that's being used for the talk. So today I'm going to be talking about mental health in the workplace. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I am a neurodiverse individual. My name is Baliga, and I'm the CEO of a startup called Diversity. We've created a platform that's like a glass door for inclusion, where companies can highlight what they're doing to create inclusive spaces, and tech talent from underrepresented groups can share what their unique experiences are like. Just to go back for a second. Today, I want to talk about the importance of understanding mental health in the workplace. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because this is a very personal story for me. And I want to make sure that others don't feel isolated and alone in how they feel about working at companies. And also talk about some concrete examples about what you can do to start approaching these conversations at your companies. So usually when I give my bio, I kind of give the professional clean bio that's like I started in the nonprofit world, doing work in social justice and community development. I did fundraising, communications, lobbying. I did grassroots organizing, door-to-door campaigns. I worked on a presidential election. I've raised millions of dollars in the 10 years I was working in the nonprofit sector before I decided to pivot into tech. And what I did was teach myself front-end web development and user experience design. Spent the last 10 years working on that up until about 3 years ago when I moved to Colorado from the DC area. And I started networking the tech scene. Siri just... So when I started navigating the tech scene in Colorado, I usually found myself as the only woman in the room, and oftentimes the only woman of color in the room. And whenever I was bringing up issues about a different way to think about some of the things that were being talked about in these meetups, I would be met by blank stares. And it was really frustrating, and I started getting really isolated and felt really alone. I stopped going to meetups, but usually when I get really sad and anxious, sometimes it channels itself into anger, and then anger turns into action for me. And so I went on a mission to go find other women and other people of color in the Colorado tech scene to just have that community again. So I found out about a team of women who were getting together for the Go Code Colorado hackathon. And we built an app over the course of a weekend that would help hiring managers find tech talent from Colorado's colleges and universities from underrepresented groups. And we pitched it at this competition, and we ended up becoming one of the 10 finalists to move on with a chance to win $25,000 to create a startup. And I hadn't really been thinking about going the startup route. I was pretty content doing the freelancer thing. But when I was in front of the Denver Performing Arts Center, in front of 300 of the technology leaders in Colorado, pitching this idea that we need to tackle this lack of diversity in tech, we didn't win the 25K, but a lot of people came up to us afterwards and were like, "We love what you're doing. This is a much needed, there's a much needed solution for a very big problem, and we want to see where you go with this." So me and one other woman on the team, who's actually one of the organizers here at the conference, Kim Schlesinger, we decided to run with it and create a startup. So that's how we started Diversity, and that's essentially what I've been doing for the last 2 years. So that's my nice little polished professional story, but there's another story that I think is really important to share, that isn't just showing, this uplifting, look how great I am thing, but really shows all the kinks in my armor and shows, that there is struggle behind all of this. And so, and I also think it's important to share this personal story because it gives some context for why I think there needs to be diversity in tech. So when I was a teenager, I was why is this? Okay. When I was a teenager, I was diagnosed with depression. And this happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, and a time when mental health was really, really discussed publicly. I also was working for organizations where we worked really long hours, and I didn't feel like I was working in a safe space where I could talk openly about mental health. And honestly, the situation stoked my fear that depression was a weakness and a sign of failure, and a secret that I had to keep really close to my chest. And my depression manifested itself in very different ways. I would have panic attacks. There were times I couldn't get out of bed. I would call in sick, especially during times of really high stress. And I was just straight up terrified of disclosing my mental illness. So I was regularly lying to friends and family about my mental health because I believed that there was really just something wrong with me. I even had one boss say to me one time, you need to be less like Lena and more like Eric. Eric was the guy that worked 18 hours a day and was totally dedicated to the cause. And, that was just, it made me think God, why am I so lazy? And, I was convinced that all my employers saw me that way. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I had my first seizure. And my brain hit the reset button. And there was really no way I thought I'd be able to get out of it or hold a full-time job ever again. So not when companies really didn't understand how to work with neurodiverse people. And it wasn't until very recently that I realized that I wasn't alone in this. As a matter of fact, it's actually way more common than you even think. I met Lance Powers, who's the co-founder of Open Labs. They're a nonprofit organization that's focused on raising awareness on mental health in the workplace. And he shared this stat with me. Every business, group, and congregation is neurodiverse, and 50% will have a brain disorder. And I wanted to dive deeper. Seriously. I wanted to dive deeper and see what was happening in the tech sector specifically. So when we started diversity, we actually launched a survey to start getting a sense of where are people both in kind of how they feel at their companies, but where are they in terms of the neurodiversity. And specifically, we were targeting underrepresented groups. And what we found was that 50% of the coders from underrepresented groups experience some type of mood disorder. So that's depression or anxiety. And yet, this isn't something that employers were really talking about. And so I started to ask myself, why isn't this being talked about? And that was one of the reasons I started diversity, because, I have this firsthand experience, knowing what it's like to work with leaders who don't want to talk about this stuff and aren't the kind of leaders that really want to dive into this stuff. And I started diversity with Kim because we wanted to create this place where where there was equity and inclusion incorporated into every single business. And when we talked about diversity, we wanted it to just go beyond race and gender. We wanted to actually think about mental illness and mental health and making sure that was part of the diversity conversation so people would feel less alone. Yet 68% of employees never discuss mental health with their employer, and another 70% of employees believe their productivity is affected by mental health issues. And this is especially true for women and people of color who already feel like they have to work harder than everyone to overcome unconscious bias. So Now we know the issues of mental health are far more ubiquitous than people are talking about. But let's dive into the data a little bit. So I found this stat, which I think is really telling and helps convey the story of why this is really important for us to be talking about. And that's the fact that companies are losing a lot of money by not addressing this. And I wanted other people to realize that they're not alone. I mean, I'm not the only one that was calling in sick when I was working my 9-to-5 job. A lot of us are doing it. And, if there's so many folks doing it and companies are losing money in the process of doing it, taking simple steps to address it, what would happen if we all went back to our companies tomorrow or this week and started saying, hey, let's start talking about this. And with these kind of two stats in mind. So one of the first things I said is okay, where can we start? How can we start changing this landscape? And I think the first place to start is with awareness. What if we start changing the script around mental illness and not think about them as disorders, but really thinking about the fact that our brain makeups are different and it's natural, and we all have unique gifts and we can all bring unique contributions. And because of the different ways our work, whether you have ADHD, depression, autism, dyslexia, all these things that are labeled as disorders, what if we just reframed it so we were just thinking these are just different ways that brains work, and they all bring strengths to the table. And then when we talk about neurodiversity, we can start talking about cognitive emotional states and the thoughts and feelings as well, in addition to kind of the way our brain works. Other people have defined neurodiversity as, with a very specific clinical place in mind, and you can start with a clinical discussion of it. But I think coming at it with the idea that brains just work differently, we don't know that much about brains, but we do know what the impact is when we're not addressing it. And the thing is, neurodiverse people look like everyone else. The fact is that very few people are open about these conditions in the workplace, and I get it. But these are all traits that we have in common to some degree or another. And so once companies recognize that mental health and neurodiversity are significant factors affecting employees in the workplace, awareness must then transition to action. And so I'm going to go over a couple of concrete ideas that you can do when you walk away from here, and hopefully start having these conversations with your employers. So first thing is we need to figure out ways to start destigmatizing mental health issues and place an importance on having good mental health. So introduce the term neurodiversity, at all orientations. So anytime you have an onboarding process and you're bringing new people on board, bring the term neurodiversity, define it, explain it, and start showing that it is okay to have this, because maybe someone might not disclose that they have any needs now, but they down the line will be able to have that conversation. Provide trainings to managers and employees on mental health awareness. Diverse and inclusive companies foster awareness by incorporating mental health into all of their engagement plans. So bringing in speakers, bringing in third-party trainers, holding monthly events. These are just kinds of ways to keep the dialogue going and showing that your company actually cares about this stuff and wants to make sure that they're addressing it. So it's about making mental health less of a taboo, and just by making it less taboo and allowing people to talk about it, it's a great way to avoid burnout, improve self-esteem, make sure people are getting sleep, understanding that people have boundaries and open communication. I'm going to go over a very concrete thing that my company did to start making that happen. The other piece is benefits. There are some, it's worthwhile going through your benefits plan, seeing what's being offered. Here's a really super easy thing that any company can do if you offer healthcare benefits. And I thought this was really powerful when I heard about a company doing this. So basically all they did was they went through the healthcare providers, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and called all of them and said, which ones are taking new patients? And then how far a walk or drive are they from the office? And they just created a list and posted it like by the elevators and common spaces. That is a huge step towards one, showing that you care about people's mental health, but two, you've removed a huge obstacle to people getting and using the service that your company's already providing. I know for me, when I was seeking out a psychiatrist in the Denver area, I think I had to call 17 or 18 places. A lot of them, the numbers were dead and those doctors were out of, like, not practicing anymore. And so the simple act of like removing that barrier, and that's a really hard barrier to overcome when you're depressed and you don't want to do anything. But if an employer just takes a day, one person in the company, just take a day, call them, create a list, that's huge. That makes a really big difference. Another way to advocate is to just figure out more ways to create the dialogue within the company culture. So you can do engagement surveys or other kinds of self-reporting tools that can be monitored. You'd have to talk with the employees about how you want to do this to make sure people feel safe and protected, but there are ways to make sure that you can start having these conversations. Another thing is your companies might have employee resource groups. Usually they kind of end at, we have a women's resource group, and then we have like maybe an LGBTQ resource group. But if you're gonna have resource groups, it might be worth talking to them about having a neurodiversity resource group for people who are neurodiverse. And that way there is a place where not only you can get together and talk about this, but it's a way to actually elevate those conversations to leadership at companies and say, hey, this is a unique group. There's a lot of us here. And there are things your company can do to actually start addressing some of the issues that are unique to our community. And finally, I can't underestimate the power of just hearing your managers talk about it. So if you're a manager, or if you report directly to a manager, which you're probably one of the two, talking to the leaders about just start normalizing that as part of the conversation. If you see a leader at the company talking about mental health, it shows you that it's okay for other people to talk about mental health, but it has to come from the leadership. It's not easy for those us with like the least amount of power organizations to start broaching topics that we feel could actually threaten our livelihood. So asking managers to talk about it, asking leaders to talk about it, and start showing that there is that people actually care about this. And then improving working conditions. A great way to help folks who are neurodiverse is to create working conditions where they can thrive. So that could be healthy meal plans, flex hours, community building activities, equipment upgrades around accessibility features. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do around this to actually create proper working conditions that help people thrive. So here's my advice around neurodiversity and for neurodivergent employees. And when you're talking about this to your employer, I think the first thing that we all have to do is start looking inwards a little bit and start asking ourselves, how do I work best? In what situation do I thrive? And what are the things that I need to be able to thrive in the workplace? I think when you use the word accommodations, you tend to think of people with disabilities who are deaf or blind or have mobile impairment. But there is such a thing as accommodations for people who are neurodiverse. We just aren't talking about it. So if we think about what kinds of accommodations we could use to thrive and work at our best, that requires a little bit more internal thinking about what makes that happen. So when you approach your employers, you can actually have concrete examples of what you would need, what kinds of accommodations you would need to be your best self. So for me, for example, I do not thrive in a 9-to-5, Monday through Friday. I am, ever since I had my seizure, there are times of the day where I just get really exhausted and have to completely check out. And that means I can't even be in an office environment. So flexible work hours is something that's really important for me in order to be able to give my best. The other thing for me is that I tend to have panic attacks if I'm in a really loud, place where there's sensory overload. And so in those cases, and I need to be able to have a place where I can have a checkout quiet room. one of the conferences I went to recently actually had a quiet room where you could just lie down, take a nap. And I thought that was amazing because conferences can be really overwhelming for me sometimes. And especially in places where like things are really loud and echoey and there's like 100 people talking and it's just too much noise for me. So to be able to like step away in a quiet room for 30 minutes helped me like get that brain re-engaged. So when I came back out, I could start like talking to people again. But like I never would have been able to do that if that space wasn't provided. So that was one of the suggestions as an employee, doing that introspection and then actually asking for accommodations. As an employer, if you're in charge of a team, one of the things you can do right away is say, what kinds of accommodations do you need in order to be your best self? What kinds of accommodations do you need to perform, in the way that you're going to be the best contributor and be the best, perform for your team? And so having those conversations regularly, but I mean, it's really important when you're onboarding, when you're starting with someone, starting with those conversations and asking what kinds of accommodations you need. And I find that when you do that, you actually have created this kind of open environment as well, where people are more willing to discuss what they need to make to be successful. And the thing is that when you start with the kind of accommodations, and the thing with neurodiversity is that things can manifest itself at certain times and not at other times. And so if someone is starting to experience early symptoms of a possible episode, being able to discuss that with your employer, and the employer can start making adjustments on how to make sure that you're successful given the scenarios that could potentially be coming through. So it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all policy. It's just recognizing that different people function differently. So I want to talk about one of the concrete things that I did with my team to make sure that everyone's getting the best out of it and to be able to start broaching these topics around neurodiversity. So we have this thing called the traffic light check-in. Excuse me. So we gleaned this idea around neurodiversity that people's brains kind of function at various levels, even on a day-to-day basis, whether you're neurodiverse or not. And so using the traffic light check-in of the idea of green, yellow, and red, we kind of do this mental check-in every day that kind of just says, like, quickly, where are we at? So the green signal means go. Our brains are open, positive, ready for the day. Yellow means slow down, proceed with caution, that our moods might be a bit below optimum capacity. And red means stop, and that's just when moods our brain's just not in the best place today. And that others should be mindful of that. So practicing the traffic light check-in at our company helped us foster a culture of transparency and being able to openly share one's mood, mental state, and thoughts without having to go into the details of like, I'm about to have a depressive episode, or, I'm having sensory overload, or whatever the thing is, because it's not really anyone's business to know what diagnosis we have, if any. Really, it's about stating kind of where we are mentally to how we can perform with the rest of the team. And what I found is that by doing this, the other members of the team started stepping up to the plate whenever one person on the team was red. For the most part, our team was green on most days, but there was the occasional time where someone on the team was red. And it wasn't a stigma. It wasn't a thing where they're like, oh, that guy's red, let's stay away from him today. It was, okay, we have to figure out what red means for that person. And you kind of start learning what red means for that person over time. And then we also, because we cared about each other, because we actually cared about each other's mental health, by saying that's going to be part of our daily check-in. That takes less than 30 seconds to do. When someone was having a red day, other people were like, what can I do to help you out? So if they're like, I can't be creative today because I'm having a red day, but I can do spreadsheets. I can just sit there and do the mindless work. Then other people can be like, okay, well, why don't you take this off of my plate and I'll take this on. So I want to end this presentation on the note that SAP staff uses the metaphor to communicate this idea across the organization, and is that people are like puzzle pieces, irregularly shaped. And historically, companies have asked employees to cut off all their irregularities and fit together in like perfect little triangles. But that requires employees to leave all of their differences at home. And differences in firms, like that difference is what allows a company to innovate. So the corporate world has mostly missed out on this benefit so far. So for those of you who are neurodiverse, have ever felt othered, I want you to know that we see you, we value you, we hear you, and that you aren't alone. So I hope that you can go back to your companies and start sharing these values and start broaching those conversations. So I also have some resources on here. I'm happy to share the deck afterwards. But yeah, I'm gonna just open it up to questions if anyone has any questions. How was the closed captioning? 90, 95%, 80%?
Three.
Thumbs up, 50%.
So, what sort of method do you do? Like, do you use Slack to check in with like the traffic light? How does that work?
We had Zoom calls every morning just for a quick 15-minute check-in. So the first thing we did, we had a standard agenda for our daily check-ins. So our daily check-ins consisted of, the traffic light, then what did you do yesterday, what hurdles did you hit, what are your goals for today, and how can we support each other. And that was just the purpose of our daily check-ins.
Okay.
So the traffic light was just the first thing we went over before we went over yesterday and today.
Just from personal experience, what sort of accommodations seem like too far from being able to manage?
I think there's not a straightforward answer to that because I think every company is different. So I can talk about my company and how we tackled accommodations. So one of the things that we did was that we created a work environment that was remote. And the really important thing was that we just had constant communication with each other. So we were on Slack, and there was a certain level of expectation that you'll communicate to us when you're not going to be available. And you'll communicate to us when you will be available. And one of the things we did is if you are sitting in front of your computer, you just do the little hand waving icon that says, hey, I'm sitting in front of my computer now. So a simple act of that means like, okay, we know we can engage with you and ask you questions and you'll be in front of your computer. But that also meant that, I'm not going to assume that you're going to be sitting in front of your computer from 9 to 5, like some of the people on the team were doing their work late at night. And that was okay. It was really just more about open communication, and then every day we check in was how we were, accounting for accountability. So as a manager of a team, my primary goal was to make sure that we were getting the work done that we needed to get done, and that we had a clear vision of where we needed to go, and that everyone was on board with that same vision. So it was really a matter of how do we make that happen, and then how do we make that happen where everyone feels they can do their best.
Can you give some examples of like community building activities that you do with your team?
Yeah, so we didn't really do any specific. The question was, can you give me examples of community building activities that you can do with your team? So one of my coders is sitting up here front and center, so that's why I'm looking at him every so often. We didn't do any specific community building activities for us, but I know that with larger companies, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. I think it's really just about going in and having conversations around it. And so even if you set aside an hour where you create like a workshop around it, where you're just educating folks around the concept of neurodiversity, and people don't have to disclose anything about themselves, but just creating that open space where you can talk about it and educate people about it. And if people care to share in any way, you've created that space to do that. Yeah.
What do you think about checking the boxes on an application? I know that it says they won't
use that information in making a selection, but I usually steer away.
So the question was, what do you think about checking the boxes on applications when you're applying for jobs around disclosing any disabilities? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the reason employers ask for it is for completely legal reasons, because there are certain requirements, especially if a company works with a government agency, that they have to comply with certain standards on this stuff. I don't think mental health is one of the things that is tracked by the EEOC.
Depression is on that list.
Oh, it's a question on what?
Depression is on the list.
Oh,
and I
depression
think,
is on the list.
Bipolar.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, like for me personally, I was terrified of being discriminated against, so I never checked the boxes. I'm scared the healthcare system is gonna discriminate against me. So I've like not checked the boxes on a lot of healthcare forms I've done. So I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. Do you have any opinions on this, Julie?
I don't think that if I tell anything,
Yeah.
because there's always a possibility of discrimination.
Okay, so you're on the
I
fence.
leave a blank.
Okay, so John's another data point here. And he also leaves it blank because he's worried about discrimination. So that's 2 data points, but that doesn't mean it's right or wrong or the best thing. Any other questions? Cool, well, I'll be around. So if you guys wanna come talk to me, and I can share the presentation, I'll work with the Develop Denver coordinators to figure out how to get the presentation out to folks. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and I hope you had a good time, and yeah.